Hello, and welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Our guest today is Margo Schlanger, the Wade H. and Dores M. McCree Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan School of Law. She also founded and heads the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse. She is the court-appointed settlement monitor for Kentucky's civil rights lawsuit dealing with the conditions of confinement for Kentucky's deaf prisoners. She served as a law clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 1993 to 1995. And then from 1995 to 1998, she was a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where she worked to remedy civil rights abuses by prisons and police departments. And then in 2010 and 2011, she served as the presidentially appointed Officer for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security. Professor Schlanger served on the Vera Institute's Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety and Abuse in America's Prisons and worked as an advisor on the development of proposed national standards implementing the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Margo, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think we should start by laying a little bit of groundwork because I think that will help our audience understand our conversation as we go forward. So I'm going to start, as I was researching, some sort of basics. So the difference between jails and prisons, because I think when people hear the term, oh, they're releasing prisoners, they have a certain picture in mind of what that means. And because these terms are used so interchangeably. So would you unpack that for us, please?
Sure. So let me start with the kind of closest to perfect definitions there are. And then, of course, like everything, it blurs, right? Because there's so many jurisdictions. Jails in general are criminal justice facilities run by cities and counties to house people who are either pretrial or who have been sentenced but not yet transferred to a longer term prison, or who have been sentenced to a sufficiently short period of time that in that jurisdiction, they're going to do that time in prison. How much that time is varies by the jurisdiction. In Kentucky, it can be up to 5 years. In lots of states, it's only up to a year. So jails are a mix. Jail, as I say, they're run by cities and counties, and they tend to churn prisoners. So average length of stay in a jail is about 30 days, but that's not taking account of the fact that many people in a jail are there for 2 days or 1 day or whatever, and a few people stay for a long time. So jails churn. On average, jails will admit into their facility in the course of a year about 20 times their population on any given day. Jails churn. Prisons are, again, mostly post-conviction incarceration for people with felony convictions and sentences of a year or more. They are run by states. Prisons much more hold than churn. On average, a prison will admit into its facility, like it'll, at any given, in the course of a year, it will admit about half as many people as live there on any given day. So prisons are run by states. Now, the federal government runs both. Some states actually run both. The state of Maryland runs some jails as well, one jail, as well as a bunch of prisons. Some states don't have any jails and they put everybody in prison. There's like a big, some states, they actually have short-term prisons that are run by the counties. So all of the stuff that I just said, every one of those sentences has some exceptions, but basically you can think of jails as county and city facilities that house a mix of prisoners, including 60 to 70% pretrial, that churn. And prisons are post-conviction state facilities that house felony offenders who are people who are convicted of felonies who are sentenced to a year or more.
Okay. And that'll be important as we move along as well, because we'll be talking about some of the efforts that were done to help alleviate some of the likelihood of people catching COVID while in a correctional facility. So I wanted to make sure people had those pictures pretty crisply in their minds first.
Yep.
So, and I'm sure if anybody's been following the news, they've been seeing a lot of articles, and actually there have even been a slew of them in the last week about the rate of infection of the coronavirus in correctional facilities. And that in general, they are seeing significantly higher infection rates than the general population. And that's both the inmates and the staff. And also obviously not just limited to federal prisons or jails, but juvenile facilities, basically anywhere where people are in fairly close contact to each other. Are there states or are there particular prisons where this seems to be more problematic than others?
Oh, no question. There are some prisons where the infection rate is currently about 100%. Like, to all intents and purposes, it's about 100%. And there are some prisons where it's much, much lower. The thing is that we don't really know what the rate is in the lower ones because there's not a lot of testing going on. And so it's very hard to say. But there's no question that there are prisons where everybody has COVID. Yeah.
And so you've mentioned that it's hard to know what the infection rates are. Do we have a sense of, do we think an accurate number of the people who may have died from coronavirus related symptoms similarly? Because if they're not being tested.
No, we don't really know. I mean, we know it's hundreds of people, but particularly people who weren't tested before they died, there hasn't been a lot of effort in many prisons to say, okay, well, that person died. Did they die of COVID-19? And so it's, I mean, we know that the count is an undercount, but we don't know by how much.
And is there a particular reason for the lack of testing other than general scarcity? I just wanted to see if it's that, and they feel as if there are better places tests could be utilized. Or
yeah, I have not heard that. I think that was true at the beginning of the pandemic, that tests were very scarce. I've not heard that currently the issue is scarcity. It may be, and I just haven't heard it, but I haven't heard it. I've been told, and I don't know that this is true, that for testing of staff, there's some reluctance to do some testing because if somebody has COVID, the system is more on the hook for some medical care issues. I don't know that that's true, or if that's sort of conspiratorial thinking, or what the story is, but you hear that from folks. As far as why they're not, the systems aren't testing other people, I feel like a big piece of the reason is that they don't want to know the answer.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the conditions in correctional facilities that enable this rapid spread.
Right. Yeah. So like any congregate living facility, prisons and jails are really kind of ideal incubators of air spread diseases. So people are crowded together. They don't have control over the things that could take them out of harm's way. They can't. I'm doing this interview from my living room, and I have minimized my contact with lots of people. So it's not only, I mean, I've decided who my cohort is going to be, which is my husband and our 2 children. And those are the people I'm in close contact with. So you can't do that in jail and prison. You can't decide who you're going to interact with, and the number is very, very large. So it's not only that you can't distance from them, although that is the case. It's very hard to maintain a 6-foot distance. As you know, the evidence that 6 feet is the right amount of distance when you're breathing the same air and it's being recycled is not so solid, right? So even if people could socially distance, it's not clear that would be enough. But these are big congregate living facilities. So that's issue 1. Issue 2, prisoners don't have control over the various precautions. So they don't necessarily have access to, if you think of the three biggest public health measures that we're all being told to take, they are socially distance, wear masks and other PPE, and wash your hands and sanitize your area often. And prisoners don't have the ability to do those other 2 very well either. Lots of prisons don't like to make hand sanitizer available. It's got a pretty high alcohol content, and they're convinced that it's subject to abuse. I'm not actually sure that's the case, but maybe it is, and they're convinced that it is. Even soap is scarce in prison and controlled, and you can't get access to it all the time. You're using, the surfaces are being used by many, many, many people. So even if you could stay 6 feet away from everybody else all the time, you'd have a lot of interaction. And PPE is scarce or non-existent. And prisons don't really want to be in the business of punishing prisoners for not wearing it. And as you know, PPE doesn't really protect you, it really protects everybody else. And so staff are reluctant to wear it all the time. Prisoners are reluctant to wear it all the time. It's a lot different than you and I wearing it when we go out of our house to go to the grocery store, where you put it on for a half hour. It's your whole life. It's
right
all the time, every day. And people are reluctant to wear it. And then there's a final reason, which is that prisons, although they're locked in, they're very porous. The staff come in and out every single day. And at jails in particular, the prisoners come in and out every single day, right? I said jails churn. That remains true. Jails continue to churn even during the pandemic.
And I was reading some articles in the last couple of weeks as well that the prison population itself just tends to be, I don't know if this is a universal statement, but I'm going to make it one, so correct me if it's not. It tends to be less robustly healthy. So, there's, you sort of have the picture in your mind of, the people working out in their gym cells and things like that. But, the meals that they get are fairly restrictive. Their access to exercise and their access to fresh air and things along that line can also be limited.
Well, so I actually think that stuff is true, and it's particularly true right now. Because prisons are spending a lot of time locked down so that they have less mixing. And so right now that's very unhealthful in general for people. But even apart from the bad food and so on, if you want a rule of thumb, the rule of thumb that doctors tell you for prisoners is add 10 years to everybody's age. So if somebody is 40, they will tend to have the medical situation of a person out of prison who's 50. If somebody's 50, they'll tend to have the medical situation of somebody who's 60. So just in general, many people who are in prison have had difficult lives with limited access to healthcare even before they got there. And things are hard. And so add 10 years. So if you're 50 in prison, you're old. Makes me feel a little awkward when I go to prisons, but whatever. So, so yes, prisons have a much higher rate of lots and lots of chronic care conditions than other groups of people do.
Okay. And you and I, when we were talking about what we were going to talk about today, you suggest that I also bring up, we talk about what do the laws say about the conditions in which prisoners should be confined. So why don't we talk about that as well?
Great. So the Constitution and lots of other laws as well, but let's start with the Constitution, governs prison conditions to some degree, right? When the state takes away your ability to make your own decisions about your life and to protect yourself from the various things that can go wrong, the burden that the state assumes by doing that is constitutionally guaranteed. So people who are pretrial are covered by the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has long said, requires that that conditions be reasonably related to the legitimate reasons that you're in jail, right? So for example, if force is used and it's excessive, if it's not reasonably related the penological, not just penological, but to the both penological interests and to running the jail and so on, well, then it's no good. And so unreasonable force is unconstitutional in jail. Likewise, deliberately indifferent, what is deliberately indifferent? We'll come back to it for a second, but deliberately indifferent medical care is unconstitutional. That's true for jail, and it's also true for prison. For prison, the constitutional hook is the 8th Amendment, the bar on cruel and unusual punishment. So not just prison, but anybody who's post-conviction. So what is deliberate indifference? Well, that there's a lot of heat being generated right this minute, battling over the meaning of the word deliberate indifference, and probably you don't care that much about that particular fight, but it's something in the neighborhood for post-conviction. It's conscious disregard of a known and serious risk of harm. And for folks who are pretrial, it's unreasonable disregard of a known of a serious harm, right? So that's kind of the space. So in other words, if the prison or jail is facing a serious risk of harm, like say the COVID pandemic, and it doesn't respond reasonably to it, it disregards it by not responding reasonably to it, well, then that is unconstitutional. And so there are dozens of cases right now, class actions and individual cases alike, that are fighting that. And some of the courts, many of the courts right this minute are holding, well, reasonable just means you're like doing the best you can in light of the circumstances. This is a pandemic. Nobody has any real idea what to do. So if you like make an effort in the direction of a response, that's good enough. Other courts say, no, that's not good enough. You actually have to respond in a way that's objectively reasonable. Your good faith isn't the question. The state's good faith isn't the question. The question is it reasonable? That's a fight that's happening in the courts right this minute. But that's the basic idea, is that the state or the county or whoever, the government is obligated to respond reasonably to risks of serious harm.
Reasonable is always one of those words that lawyers can wrangle over because there are so many circumstances that feed into what is reasonable. That there's never going to ever be such a thing as a bright line test for that. Probably. So, and I might also, I'm going to throw this out too. It would seem to me too that what might have been reasonable in, let's say, March or April, when people were really trying to figure this out, would be different than what might still be reasonable in October, November, if we're still in this situation, because at that point, the circumstances have changed again. You've had 6 months to be dealing with things, and in theory, your practices should have improved.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Also, the degree of threat may have changed, right? It might have increased, it might have decreased, right? We'll just have to see.
Right.
And a reasonable response to, gosh, the pandemic is there, but it hasn't reached here yet. And so your reasonable response is to try to fend it off versus, oh my goodness, it's here. That like what constitutes a reasonable response might be quite different.
Absolutely. We had New Jersey's Attorney General Graywall on a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about his advice. He had spoken to the prosecutors in the state of New Jersey about how they should really be focusing on, I'll call it the most egregious cases. So perhaps some of the things that they would be prosecuting, they needed to set aside for now. And I know just from talking to you and reading this, you certainly support that, not just in a pandemic situation, that there are probably a number of things that people are prosecuted for that in the grand scheme of things there may be other ways to rehabilitate or correct that problem. But so what should we be focusing on? What should we be looking at?
So in jails nationwide, jails, just to be clear, right? I'm distinguishing between jails and prisons here. Population was, as of about a month ago, down quite significantly. And that's because in a lot of places, prosecutors and judges were making a real effort to substitute other responses as opposed to just putting somebody in jail, and also to hustle people through if they were going to get out anyway, to run the bail hearings quicker, that kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So just get people out. So that was true in jails. There are some signs, but the data aren't completely clear yet, that that's beginning to tilt back towards the pre-pandemic population, and that in a bunch of places, jail population might be going back up again. I'm worried about that. The population decrease has given the jails a little bit of a chance to help people stay farther apart from each other, to allow the staff who are sick to stay home. There's been, and in general, it does seem like if putting somebody in jail, it puts them in harm's way, that damn, we better have a good reason before we do it. So I'm worried about that in jails. In prisons, there has not been so much of a decline in population. There's been a little, but not so much. Parole hearings have been accelerated a little bit. So the people who were just waiting for a parole hearing, not because they were ineligible, but just it wasn't their turn yet. There are some systems that have kind of moved those along faster. There's been some compassionate release. There's been, some switches to home arrest, that kind of stuff. But in general, those numbers have been, the population decline has been much, much less in prison than it has been in jail. So, so it seems to me that I hope that I think that the pandemic might be receding elsewhere, but there's no sign that it's receding in jails and prisons, or at least there's no sign that it's receding in prison. I don't actually know what the data show in jails. The data are much, much less clear. But in prisons, there's no sign. The testing results are not declining. There's still, like, it just seems like in prison, the pandemic is raging.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope that there will be some relief of population pressure. I think, as I say, you don't want to put people in harm's way if you're not getting a big public benefit for it. And there are people in prison who, like, they could be out, they could be on parole, they could be on house arrest, they could be out. And the same thing for jails. I hope that population, I hope we can keep the population down. I hope we can learn from the emergency experiment of keeping those folks out. We can learn how to keep the populations down in general.
Is there advocacy that you're seeing or hearing about, or work that you're seeing to help, I guess, to help fight for this? So you mentioned, they could be on home detention. There are other mechanisms that do not require them to be kept captive in a physical space with other people who are experiencing this. And again, that's not a universal statement, because for some people that is what needs to happen. But what sort of work or advocacy are you seeing I'm not sure if it's with the attorneys general, or if it's working with other advocacy groups, or
Right.
Governor's offices, whatever it is?
It's a lot of different things. So there's been a lot of work with local prosecutors and judges to try to lop off a chunk of the docket. There's been, and do something else with them, or to lower bonds so that people who a judge says, yep, you would be good to get out if you had $10,000, and then she doesn't have $10,000, to make it $2,000 instead, or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of work with local prosecutors and judges. There's been a lot of work with Supreme Court, state Supreme Courts, to try to get them, and a number of them have responded and have encouraged local judges to do things along these lines. There's been a good deal of work with governors also, but with a little bit less effect. I mean, because it's been, as I said, it's been more effective in the jails than it has been in the prisons. The governors have more control over the prisons, and the governors haven't responded so much. The work has been with pretrial people.
Okay. And is there the potential of bumping into some of the mandatory sentencing guidelines as well, that are just going to be a hurdle to get over?
I mean, some, but not so much. I mean, sure. Governors have the ability to work around those, particularly during a public health crisis, and they mostly have chosen not to.
Gotcha.
I mean, the other thing is that there's been a massive amount of litigation. ranging from individual applications for compassionate release or for health-related parole and the like, right, which are done individually with different kinds of litigation techniques, state habeas applications, those sorts of things, state resentencing applications, federal resentencing, those, right? So there's been a lot of that. And there's been some litigation, whether done under the, technically under habeas corpus writ or under an injunctive action. A few of those have been somewhat successful, mostly not so far.
And for those in our audience who may not understand resentencing, could you explain that?
Yeah, so if a person gets sentenced to, I don't know, 2 years in prison, in certain circumstances, the judge that handed down that sentence could resentence them instead to a year, say. So it varies. The resentencing authority varies by state, but judges do have some authority to revisit the sentence that they previously delivered.
Nice. Okay. In thinking through some of the questions I was going to ask you, I think one of the things I kept bumping into was public perception of prisoners. And so a lot of people view prisoners as, okay, yes, you've done something wrong. You sort of deserve what happens to you. There are obviously a number of people who view this as a human rights issue and certainly a human rights crisis. And then there are those who perhaps have the aforementioned opinion. How can we help people? It's sort of like, how do you change someone's mind on something like that? How do we help people see the humans underneath this,
Right.
and that they still have rights even though they are incarcerated?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there's two different questions. One is, did the people deserve to go to prison? And, your mileage may vary on this question, right? Some people are more reluctant to send people to prison than other people are. But let's imagine that, that in going to prison, when you walk behind the prison gates, when you walk in the door, at the very start of your sentence, there's a 6 bullets in a gun and you spin the revolver. I'm sorry, there's 1 bullet in a six chamber revolver, and you spin the revolver and then you shoot the guy. Maybe we can agree that that's not what he got sentenced to. I think we can agree that that's not what he got sentenced to. So if people are being put in harm's way when they get sent to prison in a way that's not random and hard to predict and so on, it's just like, this is how airborne diseases work. The way that airborne diseases work is that when you put people in big congregate facilities and you don't allow them to do the things that you and I do to try to stay healthy, a lot of them are going to get sick. And when they get sick, especially if they had compromised health to begin with, a lot of them are going to die. It does seem to me that set of circumstances puts the onus on us as the polity to say, do they really need to be there? Like, really? The Justice Stevens wrote in a dissent in a prison conditions case a while back. He wrote that in Andersonville, which was a POW camp for Union soldiers, that in Andersonville, he was trying to say that intent isn't the thing that matters, and that in Andersonville, where about 1/3 of the POWs died, they died of malnutrition and neglect and diphtheria, if I'm remembering correctly. They died of diseases because nobody cared enough to get them out of those unhealthful conditions and put them in a place where they wouldn't die. And 1/3 of them died. And he said that was no less torturous and no less inappropriate because it wasn't desired by the folks who ran that prison. And that seems to me to be just a profound truth. Like, you don't put people in harm's way when you don't have to, and we don't have to.
Well, and so one of the things I was also struck by in my attempt to educate myself on this before our conversation was certainly the number of staff in prisons that is being affected by this as well has either because of actual infection or fear of infection reduced that staff population as well. And so now even the conditions with inside, and I guess I'm focused more on prisons in this instance likely than jails, the conditions inside as well are changing. And so that perhaps oversight or the people who may be there to take care of the prisoners may also be missing at this point.
Yeah, so there's a combination of things. One is that because of how many people are there and how squeezed in they are and so on, the staff are also in harm's way. And the second is that when the staff deal with the fact that they're in harm's way and they stay home because they've been exposed or infected or whatever, they got sick, whatever, you're absolutely right. The facilities are ending up very significantly understaffed. And some of them, what's happening as a result of that is that conditions have gotten kind of dangerous and neglectful. And some of them, what's happening as a result of that is that just all the things that normally happen are not happening. So prisons have not only shut down live visits, right, which you'd expect, but they've also shut down, some of them have shut down other forms of contact between prisoners and their family. Not all of them. Some of them have actually increased phones, for example, but some of them have said, no, we're going to lock everybody down, and that means that they're going to have less access to the phones, right? Or some of them have shut down recreation, and you get it, right? Because recreation was a time, and when I say recreation, what I mean is when they're allowed to use the track or the gym. It's not, it's not like they're not taking Zumba classes,
Right.
but by shutting that down, you decrease the congregate activity, and that makes sense. But the result is that everybody is locked in with nothing to do all day, which is bad for them and is painful for people. And they've done that not only because of the congregate stuff, but because they don't have enough staff to run safely. And so they can't even, in some of them, they're not even letting people out in small groups because they don't have enough staff to run that stuff. A lot of prisons have shut down a lot of even quite urgent medical care for multiple reasons. For one reason, because sometimes that required people to go off the prison grounds.
Right.
But also because it required escorts, and they don't have escorts, even if the people are healthy or if appropriate precautions can be taken. And so I've heard innumerable stories of people who were scheduled for chemo that isn't happening because there's nobody to escort them in a way that they need. So yeah, prisons are getting harsher and less supervised as a result of all of this too.
Is that also impacting, and I'm thinking, well, wouldn't consider legal representation tangential, but is that also impacting lawyers' access to their clients? I was also thinking of a lot of, there's, sometimes educational advisors or even ministry representatives who go into prisons. Has that also been affected?
Yep, all of it. I mean, lawyers the least out of those three, but education, religion, and lawyers is the least affected out of the three. But yes, so what some prisons have done is they've substituted video visitation for lawyers. Video visits can, or just phone calls for lawyers. That stuff can work, but it doesn't always. It sort of depends on your client. It depends on the technology. It depends on whether you had paper you needed to share. It depends on a bunch of things. And so people are finding that very strained and difficult. As far as education and ministry, in many prisons, it's just stopped.
Okay, great. There's been a lot of talk in the news at the moment about the variety of systems that need to change. And a lot of the conversation focuses on, we've moved beyond the point of rehabilitation or tweaking or making small changes. It's more, we may need to sort of tear it all down and build it back up. Is that something reasonably we can do with the prison system?
Are you talking about, there's been a lot of talk related to Black Lives Matter and policing, or are you talking about pandemic related conversations?
I was flipping it more towards Black Lives Matter and policing, but I'm mindful of, there have been certainly a lot of, I don't even know if it's very swift changes in the prison system just in this year. And so wondering, in terms of correcting the corrections, is there a way to actually correct it, or is it?
Yeah. So I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think that it is available to systems that want to do pretty significant decarceration and pay very little or no price in public safety for it. So we've seen that from juvenile corrections, because over the past decade or so, there's been an enormous decarcerative move in juvenile corrections, and there hasn't been a corresponding increase in juvenile crime. So it does seem, and it's absolutely established that prisons are in part, I don't mean this is all that's going on in them, but that prisons are in part what criminologists call criminogenic, meaning that people go to prison and for a bunch of reasons that actually increases crime. So it increases crime because it cuts them off from their families and support systems. It decreases their employability and so on. It introduces them to cohorts of folks who are kind of out of the legitimate economic system and increases their ties to that group of folks. And prison is damaging, and people with mental health decompensate in prison. People who are sick get sicker in prison, and there's a whole bunch of things, right? So prisons are criminogenic. Now, they may also be deterrent for some people in some circumstances, although it's pretty clear that long sentences don't deter more than less long sentences. I don't mean like a 10-year sentence might deter longer than a 1-year sentence, but a 10-year sentence probably doesn't deter any more than a 9-year sentence or an 8-year sentence. And so there's years and years and years of incarceration that aren't performing any deterrent function at all. So if you think about all of that stuff together, it would be really possible to do without doing anything very radical. You could also do something much more radical and abolish prisons, right? But that's not quite what you're asking.
Right.
Like, it would be pretty easy to, and I should also say, the degree of variation among the states in prison sentencing is extreme. So my own home state of Michigan is a high sentence jurisdiction. Ohio next door is somewhat lower. You do the same crime, and the crime rates aren't particularly different between those, right? You do the same crime in Toledo versus crossing over into Metro Detroit, right, which is not any distance, and you commit that crime, you're subject to a very different kind of criminal sanction. So it would be pretty easy to decrease the prison population by a lot without radically changing how we think about criminal justice, just by saying, that's just too long. That sentence, that's just too long. That person, they don't need to go to prison, right? You could also do something much more significant and actually do something that's abolitionist, and the way that people are talking about policing, where you substitute other kinds of social services but I'm not like, I think that it would be good to do some of those things, but you don't even have to go there to decrease the prison population. That's why there's all these projects about decrease the prison population by 50%. Remember that in my lifetime, our prison population was total across the United States, all the jails, all the prisons, 300,000 people. And right this minute, it's more than 2.2 million.
Mm-hmm.
So we have tried the biggest experiment in mass incarceration in history, and we have it in our power to reverse that and bring it back down. And all the evidence is that we could do that without paying a major public safety cost for it. And yeah, I think it's totally possible.
That was actually this past weekend. I rewatched Ava DuVernay's 13th. And that was one of the things I had forgotten, the interstitials that she has between the various segments of, in 1960, the prison population was this, in 1970, it was this. And just to see that exponential growth from, I'd say, about the mid 70s to now.
Yeah, I mean, we've been plateaued basically for about 10 years, right this minute. But yeah, starting in about 1971, 1972 was where the big run up was. There was actually this very famous article in 1970, which said prison is an archaic holdover from a prior approach to criminal justice. Because the prison rate, I'm going to try to do this where the video can see me, was all this like shallow slope decline. And this article, which was by a famous criminologist, got published in 1970, and in 1971 and 72, in kind of Nixonian America, that's when the increase started. So yeah, it's in living memory that we had a very, very different system. There's no reason that we can't revive some of the reluctance to ruin people's lives like that.
All right, so we're going to give people a chance to ask some questions now. I'm going to remind everybody, I'm talking with Margo Schlanger, and we're talking about prisoners' rights, pandemic justice, and beyond. So please let us know what questions you have. And we have our first from Helena. So she says, currently, I understand the Federal Bureau of Prisons is using the CDC guidelines and really only testing prisoners who show symptoms, despite the fact that prisoners who are asymptomatic have died. Should there be pressure on Congress to revise the CDC standards? Or should there be some other pressure on how testing in prisons is going?
I think that there's a lot of good reasons to do testing pretty broadly. I don't actually think it's a good idea for Congress to get in the business of telling the CDC what its standards should be. So I also note that the CDC has a lot of different standards, and its standards on jails and prisons have been the same now for a couple of months, as I understand it. And I'm hearing from a lot of people that the standards on other congregate facilities, which have been a little bit more responsive and are a little less politicized, that might be the place to get appropriate testing protocols from.
Oh, interesting. So nursing homes, I'm just trying to get a sense of.
So I haven't actually looked at this myself. So maybe I misunderstood what I've been told, but I've had a couple of conversations with people where they've told me that, and I haven't then gone and checked it, but yes.
Gotcha. Okay. A little off topic, but we did get a question about, I think it was the governor of Iowa, who recently restored or is making moves to restore voting rights to prisoners who've been released. I believe Iowa was the last state to have, you had to petition in order to have those restored. And I may not be remembering that story exactly correctly. But just sort of thoughts on, in general, the rights of the incarcerated changes.
Yeah, so I don't think it's the case that Iowa was the only state where, I'm sorry, my phone on my thing is ringing. I thought I had it all turned off, but apparently not. I don't think it's the case that Iowa was the only state where you had to petition. That said, I think it's much, much better policy not to have to petition for a restoration of voting rights. And there are a lot of states where you don't lose your voting rights at all when you go to prison, except when you're in prison. Michigan is one of those. Michiganders who are in prison can't vote while they're serving their sentence, but as soon as they get out, they're eligible to vote. There's no restoration needed. There are even 2 states that let prisoners vote while they're in prison, Maine and Vermont. And, I guess what I think is that voting isn't about virtue. Voting is about whether you're a member of the polity, and people who are in prison are members of the polity. So I guess what I would say is over the past decade, there have been hundreds of baby steps towards better enfranchisement of former prisoners, and like the more the merrier of those steps.
Great. Okay. I may mispronounce this name. So Hitali asked, it seems like another thing that might be put on hold right now would be transfers between facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to avoid mixing populations. Is that still happening, or are transfers still happening? And if so, is there a rationale for that?
It varies by the state, whether transfers are still happening, but in general, there have been a lot fewer transfers during this pandemic time than prior to that. What I've been told is that the policy and the practice don't completely match. So the federal system, which has the most, I mean, if you just think about it, right, the federal system covers the whole country and has the most prisons of any system and so on. So the federal system is where the most where transfers are the most salient. And they've had some policy to shut those down. I have been told that that policy has not always been honored, but I don't really have any solid information. In some systems, I think it is the case that transfers have mostly stopped. I'm quite sure that in some systems they have
not. Are there things that have been happening as a result of Black Lives Matter? And I'm thinking about the curfews that some cities have been imposing, specifically, that have the potential for sort of swelling the jail population, as you and I were talking about when we started?
Yeah, I think there have been, and just arrests of protesters and so on, right? So yes, and even if those people don't actually ever get booked into prison, even if they, into jail, even if what happens is they get arrested and they get sort of processed en masse and so on, that too has some pandemic related consequences and might be problematic. How many people have actually been booked in as opposed to been arrested and then released? I don't have any data on that. I don't really know the answer.
Mm-hmm. If people in our audience want to learn more about this or want to get involved, be some of the change that they'd like to see in this world, what would you recommend for them?
I mean, to learn more, I think there are a bunch of sites that have really been doing some terrific kind of journalism around all of this. The Marshall Project has done some great stuff and has a COVID-19 kind of tag. And so you can go to the Marshall Project and get all the COVID-19 stories, not only that they themselves have done, but that they're collecting from journalistic outfits all over the country. The Prison Policy Institute has some stuff that's very much, that's great information as well. So those are the two places that that to me are collecting what's coming in. So, and if people want to get involved, I mean, the folks who are litigating right this minute are public defenders, and especially the ACLU nationwide, which has quite a large number of these cases. And then anybody who's sort of doing normal litigation on prison stuff, right? The Southern Poverty Law Center, the Prison Law Office, the Prisoners Legal Services of New York. They're sort of the usual suspects if one follows prison litigation. But I don't know that volunteers are all that relevant. In some states, the volunteers, there are people who are doing, kind of supportive protests. So for example, in Illinois, there's an active movement to be supportive of the folks who are in prison. And for a while, the prisoners weren't getting masks and so on. And a bunch of volunteers actually sewed, I think they sewed them, maybe they bought them, but I think they sewed them, thousands of masks to give to prisoners in the system. So who's doing work like that is really going to vary by state. And unfortunately, I don't know what all of those organizations are.
Yep. And part of my preparation for our talk today, I spent a lot of time on the Marshall Project's website. They have a lot of really great graphs that enable you to sort of see what's happening in your state. and get a sense of the prison population being affected, the staff being affected, also in terms of how that compares to the general infection rates in the non-incarcerated inhabitants of the state. So that was really interesting for me to spend some time with. So that looks like the end of our questions at the moment. I feel like I would be a little remiss, though, if I did not bring Justice Jackson into this. And so he had written an address called "Striking at the Roots of Crime," and sort of walks through various. He talks about how parole is not really release. It's, it's very supervised. It's a lot of the conversations we've been having. And what I was struck by was his biggest thought was, in order to do this, we need to make the conditions that people live in better, so that they are not trying to alleviate that by committing some crime. So is it you need to increase the resources in communities? Is it they need to have access to better education, to, I think he even specifically mentions parks and recreational facilities, and things along that line that brings these resources into communities to help then increase or better the lives of the people who live there. And that struck me particularly because I've been listening to a lot of the Black Lives Matters and participating in some rallies, and that is a lot of the focus of that. And I think part of what you were saying, sort of with talking about defunding the police, is that there are other ways to start attacking these challenges that we're having.
At this point, it's a cliche, but a true cliche, that prisons and jails are the largest mental health institutions in the United States. Now, I, for one, think that the shutting down of large-scale, quasi-permanent psychiatric facilities and facilities for people with intellectual disabilities, where they were kind of warehoused there, and that's what happened to them, I think that's been a positive move in the American life. Nonetheless, it is true that at this point, when you measure sort of beds and dollars and bodies, the major response to psychiatric illness in this country is to incarcerate. And that's nuts. So the proportion of people in prison who are psychotic, who have diagnosed psychoses, is astronomical. The proportion who have other mental health diagnoses is even much, much higher. But the proportion of people who have diagnosed psychosis is really very high. And those are people who they come into the criminal justice system in ways that we should be doing better by them. And so I don't mean that what Justice Jackson said isn't true for everybody, but I think the starkest place where you can see that, and also the place where Black Lives Matter and some of the policing stuff has been very noticeable, is, wait, why are we having a criminal justice response to what is a mental health episode? Why are we doing that? And we need to fix that. And if we could fix that, that would both have population impacts on prisons, and it would make the prisons it would make them more humane. You'd have some time and attention to try to then deal with the next group of people who don't need to be there. And you could then you could say, okay, that one's done, now what's the next slice? And then the next slice, and then the next slice.
Yep. No, and that makes sense. And then that leads me to start to wonder about the prison industrial complex. So, you have for-profit prisons in addition to the state-run facilities. And so then you also get into people have varying incentives to work through this. I mean,
that's absolutely true. I don't know that it's true in such, there's not much evidence that the states that have high levels of privatization in terms of incarceration are incarcerating differently than you'd expect from their politics in general. So I don't know about, let me say this. At this point, it's not just a question of who has private prisons, but every prison is privatized to some extent. Every prison has private entities that are providing, say, medical care, or not, it's not always medical care, just to be clear, but very, very often medical care or food or whatever. And even the public employees at the prison have some economic reasons to want that prison to stay populated, right? So I don't know that it provides a lot of leverage on the problem to think about this as a privatization problem. If you think about it in terms of incentives of different people, sure, but I'm not enamored of the idea that if only we could get the private prisons out of the prison business, that we would have solved the problem. I suspect that's not the case.
Yep. No, that makes sense. Absolutely. All right. So Margo, thank you so very much for being with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. I believe that we will be talking about the Bostock case next Thursday, but I'm still trying to nail down who our speaker is. So stay tuned for that. And I'm actually even feeling a little hesitant previewing that just in case. But that's certainly my goal and what I'm working towards. And so I look forward to seeing all of you next week on Thursday at 3. Thank you so much, Margo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.